really light, maneuverable, but still planting. Oh. Works well under braking. Orbea's all-new Rallon has to be one of the hottest bikes of 2025. I don't think there was one negative comment when this bike first launched, and to the user, it makes a lot of sense. You can basically build two bikes in one. It can be an enduro bike like you see here, or after changing a couple of suspension components, and actually a lot of other components, it can be a downhill bike as well. And that's because it uses the same front and rear triangle. So it's very appealing, very good looking, has a ton of features packed into this, as well as a bunch of adjustments, even more than the downhill bike. So we'll explain how that conversion's made and all the benefits of this bike, as well as the ride impression. Compared to the outgoing Rallon, this is a totally different bike. This is a beast. For starters, the travel has been bumped up. It now has a 180 fork and 170 mils of rear wheel travel, so 10 mil more at either end than the outgoing bike. And then the suspension layout, it is slightly different looking, although it does still use a single pivot swing arm. This now has a rocker link that actuates across the seat tube. And it carries over some other attributes that you would find on the old Rallon, like this little tool hidden in the main pivot. Still got that thing. You still have the down tube storage compartment, as well as a water bottle that fits in here, although it is tight. And you still have the same boost concentric 2 swing arm. So that's that co-rotating pivot around the axle. The main topic of this bike is the gravity link, and this is this sort of shock basement or mounting bracket that the shock sits on, and this can carry an extra weight as well as housing a 4-way adjustable flip chip for the shock. So it gives you a high and low BB or slacker steeper head angle setting, as well as a low and high progression mode. So you can really tailor this bike to be sort of a park bike with a long chainstay and a mixed wheel, or more of an enduro bike with a short chainstay and a 29-inch rear wheel. Up at the head tube, you also have more adjustment, and that is a sort of offset headset that has both a minus 0.75, a 0, and a plus 0.75 adjustment. So tons of geometry to change within the front triangle. The Rallon has 4 different sizes, and those coincide with most other brands: small, medium, large, and extra large. To give you sort of an idea of where those land, the small starts at 425 and they jump up in 25 mil increments of reach. So this puts the size large that I was riding at 475, and that's in the slackest of all the positions with the longer 450 millimeter chainstay. There is also a 442 chainstay to choose from, but again, that's something you can't change on the fly. You need to change the entire rear triangle or swing arm of the bike. In the slackest mode, so this is the bike in the low setting down here, and then the minus 0.75 head tube cup arrangement, that puts the head angle at 63.2 degrees, which is actually slacker than the downhill bike, believe it or not. The seat tube angle is still incredibly steep at 78.8 degrees, and it can actually go steeper when you make all those other adjustments. So this bike has a fairly long wheelbase with the long chainstay and the slack angles all set, but then when you're riding it uphill, it can make it feel a bit more compact, I would say, especially it being so upright as well. Dissecting the suspension on the Rallons is pretty interesting, because most people want to know, how do you get 200 mils out of a downhill bike and then change a shock and still make an enduro bike pedal well? Well, the key is that gravity link for one, but also changing the shock length. The enduro bike runs on a 205 by 62.5 trunnion mounted shock, and the downhill bike, well, it's a 225 by 75. So a longer eye to eye, but also a longer stroke as well. You can see on the graphs that the anti-squat of the downhill bike starts around 50% and tapers off, whereas the enduro bike starts just under 100. Now that's not quite as high as some dual link VPP or GW link bikes, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't pedal well. And there are 2 tricks to this. The first is that super steep C-tube angle at almost 80 degrees. It really keeps your weight forward while climbing, and that also means your center of gravity is further forward, so there's less sort of bobbing or leverage that your body has over the back half of the bike. And the other one, although it's a bit of a cheat code, is that the Rallon is available with the Fox Float X Live Valve Neo shock. And this is an electronically controlled shock that automatically closes or firms up based on the grade that you've chosen in the app. We'll talk about how that compared to the downhill-oriented Fox Float X2 further in the review. Setting up the enduro version of the Rallon was so much more intuitive than the downhill bike. There was just something about it when I jumped on. My hands and feet were just in the right places. The front to rear wheel balance felt spot on. So I felt really at home, really comfortable right away. I would say that, like the downhill bike though, it does have that overarching theme of having a very tall stack where you ride really low in the bike, which is a good thing, but it almost felt like there was more front wheel sort of ahead of my hands rather than just the front center being long. Compared to the first ride, there were a couple changes that I made. The first being dropping that stem height. I ended up running just 10 mils of spacers under the stem. And then for the head tube angle, I left that in the slackest setting pretty much the entire time. But I did play with the 4-way adjuster down here, and I would say that the more progressive setting pairs really well with the Fox Float X live valve. And that's because you can really maximize that sensitivity at the start of the stroke when you're going downhill to get a lot of traction over rocks, slippery roots, and things like that. But then anytime you need to pedal, which is normally on an uphill, you have this shock to really kick in that support that you need and firm up the platform on the shock. So the bike doesn't end up striking the cranks very often whatsoever. Versus the linear setting, I ended up favoring the Fox Float X2. This is a much bigger air volume can, so you might get a bit more progression out of this. I found that this worked really well in the bike park. It gave the bike a lot of support and platform to push off earlier in the stroke than the progressive setting and the shock. For the pressures in the suspension, up front we got the Fox 38 180 mil travel. I ran that at 100 PSI with one bung spacer in there, and that was roughly 12% sag. For the rear shocks, with the progressive setting and the Fox Float X live valve, I ran that at 186 PSI. That equated to about 26% sag. I'd go a little bit more with the Float X2 in the linear just because, yeah, you want that bit more sensitivity in the linear setting, but then also you can get more progression out of the bigger air can on the Float X2. So yeah, roughly 26% on this and 28 on the Float X2. And then moving to the back half of the bike, yes, I ran a MX wheel the entire time and this 450 mil chainstay. It really feels lengthy, but also maneuverable. It's easy to tip. It feels stable in the bike park. The rollover or breakover angle is pretty good, not smacking the cranks very often, even with a 32 ring and 165 cranks. So yeah, I found this bike to be really impressive in pedaling well outside its capabilities of trails, tackling more flatter terrain without any issue. Yes, it's a little bit more work, or maybe a bit more muted because it has so much more travel. You're gonna have to work harder to play on all these little side hits and such, but once you get it in the bike park, it really comes alive and sort of like a backcountry ski of sorts, where you can really sort of access any terrain and then really maximize on sort of the spicier terrain. It can really take on big drops, huge lines, steep chutes. It is almost a downhill bike, like, pretty obvious with that frame overlapping with the downhill bike, but it is still something that you can pedal quite comfortably because of the seated position. And lastly, talking about the seat tube, this thing is ultra low, very short. It also has a ton of insertion depth. So even on the size small, you can run a 240 post with the collar totally slammed. And that just gives you a lot of maneuverability around the bike. You can almost tuck your knees over the top tube when you're turning. So with that, let's get into some ride impressions. We'll start with climbing and then descending. Okay, so we're climbing up Cypress on the Rallon to do some downhill tracks. And yeah, this thing is a lot of travel, but you know what? It does not pedal like a soggy old bike. The overall weight is pretty low, and although Orbea did make some concessions in the anti-squat to reduce the pedal kickback, they still managed to make this thing pedal pretty darn well. I've been riding the Rallon with the live valve, maybe cheating a bit. I've spent a fair bit of time on the Float X2 as well. And even without using the climb switch, it's pretty impressive. It doesn't bog down or feel soggy in more undulating terrain where you really need to work the bike, manipulate it, shift the weight forward. Like we mentioned, the overall weight is pretty low. Even with downhill tires, it was pretty respectable. Another thing you definitely notice on this bike is the climbing position. The seat tube angle is quite steep, and even with a very low BB in the low progressive setting and the slackest head angle possible, it still goes uphill really well, even though I'm out of breath right now. I would say maybe the live valve would suit somebody who is not ready to give up their enduro bike, but still wants something that pedals fairly well. And the Float X2 might be more inclined to riders who either shuttle or use a lift a fair bit of the time, or they're just not too bothered to race up techie climbs. They're just gonna sit and spin on a climb trail or a road. Okay, so by now the Rallon downhill bike review should be out, and if you read that one, you would know the first thing I have to say about this bike in general is just how grounded and low and planted they feel. And this definitely holds true for the enduro bike as well. I've mainly been riding it in the low progressive mode with the Float X live valve shock, but then also spent a fair bit of time on the X2 as well. Spent a lot of time in the bike park on this thing. Really loved it. Very stable bike. Really handles the big hits in the progressive setting. Yeah, in the progressive setting. Really handles all this little slippery tech fit well. And then the linear mode really works well in the bike park. Just holds the bike up higher. Allows you to push into jumps, kind of get that support and pop you're looking for. Nice thing about this thing with the Float X live valve on here, we're doing a little traverse. No need to grab the climb switch, it just turns on and off automatically. So yeah, even as a big travel bike, this thing handles very lightly, even riding the longer chainstay. And it corners well, it just feels really balanced, aggressive, tall stack. Yeah, the other thing I could say about this bike is that just knocked that one by, but yeah, this bike really helps you recover from any of those instances. Really light, maneuverable, but still planted. Works well under braking. Okay, so let's talk about how planted this bike is and setup. I've been running long chainstay, mullet, and you actually need a different gravity link to switch it over to 29, so I haven't had a chance to do that yet. But the other thing I could say about this bike is how much quieter it is in comparison to the downhill bike. It's really noticeable how silent, settled this bike is, but still rides light at the right time as well. Doesn't feel like a big old soggy pig. Another tree down. Get out of there. So yeah, really lets you dive into corners, really low BB. And yeah, just digging this bike. I would honestly put it up against some of my favorite enduro bikes out there, like a Nomad. Really could hang with that. And we talked about the stiffness and the downhill bike review as well. This is quite a bit softer than a Nomad, especially the rear end of the bike, which yeah, is way more forgiving in this techie stuff. We come out to the road. I also talked about the seat tube angle in the downhill bike review. And yeah, we talked about that in the climbing as well, but basically this super steep seat angle and big insertion depth lets you get a 240 post in here and totally slam it in the bike. It's almost like a scooter. So no need to make any adjustments even for those tall guys. Again, yeah, really good bottom out support there. That final hit. There you go. That is a wet and wild action pack lap down Cypress on the Rallon. Yeah, really digging this thing. When talking about the value of the Rallon, well, first, it is not an inexpensive bike. It is only available in a carbon frame, which means that you can build a frame set up from 4,300 bucks. That includes a shock as well as the gravity link with one of the weights. Like all Orbeas, you can build this with their custom My-O configurator. So first you get to choose your frame size, chainstay length, then your paint scheme, wheel size, and anything else you want to put on the bike. If you want to build up custom parts, you can do that with their configurator. That being said, there are 3 pretty good already standing models to choose from. You have the E10 starting at 5,700 bucks, then moving up to the E-Team at 7,200, and finally this E-LTD with the Fox Float X live valve, all the top of the line components, electronic shifting, what have you. That one goes for a cool 10 grand. I would say the most valuable build, in my opinion, is the E-Team, sort of the middle tier. And that's because you get the factory suspension and some stronger brakes on there compared to the E10. If I was gonna compare the Rallon Enduro to another lightweight, long travel, sort of hard charging, do it all Enduro bike, I would have to pick the Transition Spire. The Spire was one of those bikes where I rode it and I thought, wow, okay, you can really take this sort of beyond what it's intended to do. And I mean, in a less aggressive way, you can really ride this bike on long days because it is available in a carbon frame. It has 29-inch wheels. And then when you're sending it downhill, it does have a very slack setting as well. So there are a lot of possibilities on the Spire. It's also a really comfortable pedaler because of the seat tube angle. And I think a lot of those attributes sort of are reflected in this Rallon as well. Big travel, lightweight frame. It can pedal. The Rallon, it is a little bit more new school in that the stack is much taller. You can run an MX wheel. It's something you can't do on the Spire technically without using an angle set or anything like that. And then this does have obviously the storage as well. So there are a couple newer sort of features and things to be found on this Rallon. Moving along to the pros and cons, let's start with the negatives this time, although there aren't that many. The first is a bit of a standout. This bike is expensive. There is no aluminum option. The second, and it's very nitty gritty, but the water bottle access is pretty tight in here. I have this cage slid all the way back with a standard 650 ml bottle. It does knock against the top tube. I did have to put a little dab of mastic tape on here. For the pros, the first one has to be the versatility of this bike. It's a lightweight frame, it has a lot of travel, but it can go well beyond its intended use of just being a gravity-oriented or enduro race bike. The second, and it kind of plays on that first one, is the adaptability of the geometry that's built into this. The possible geometry combinations are endless. It can also accommodate a bigger rear wheel if you want to go that route. And then lastly would be the low standover and low center of gravity of this bike that just really allows you to move around the bike almost like you're riding a downhill bike. So then what did I think about Orbea's Rallon Enduro? Well, if it wasn't obvious already, I really enjoyed my time on this bike. It's definitely going to rank up there in the top bikes of 2025 for me. I think Orbea really knocked this one out of the park with it being a fairly lightweight package and having long travel downhill capabilities, but then still being fairly adaptable too. I'm really curious to see how people build these bikes up over time and if they spring for, live valve shocks or 29ers to see sort of what is the most popular way to build this bike. You could even put the downhill shock and the downhill gravity link on here if you wanted to. So give us a shout in the comments and let us know how you'd build one of these, and stay tuned for more reviews.